Hi, I'm Jan. Welcome to my studio here in Hamburg. It's a great pleasure to join this online conference. Before I start with my actual presentation, let me quickly tell you about DebFoo. I'm one of the co-founders of DebFoo, and what we do is that we allow teams to conveniently update their dependencies by giving you pull requests that contain all the information that you need. We just launched a new feature which allows you to not only update your Ruby gems and your Node modules, but also your Ruby version and your Node version. And we find that this is quite an interesting feature and people really like it, so please try it out. Now, before I actually start with my presentation, here's a quick warning. Please don't try to understand the code examples on my slides. This is not meant as an insult. I just put this code on the slides to give you a quick and easy look at the involved complexities and stuff like that, and it's less about actually understanding what's going on. All the code is available at rubysynth.fun and on GitHub, and you can take a look at it whenever you're ready to look at it with enough time. And I think it really makes sense if this stuff interests you to go there and check it out later on. First, let's make some music. Well, as you can see, this takes way too much time. So now finally we have some music, but let's, just for the sake of this presentation, speed it up so that we can get to a result within the presentation. I just sped up this video by 300% and I kind of like the sound effect that this creates. Believe me, you don't want to watch this in real time. This is the end result. Now this is done with SonicPy by Sam Aaron, and you can find it at sonicpy.net. And if you want to try it out and play around with it, I think it's a great tool to learn how to make music, but also how to learn programming. And if you want to support Sam, who's been working on this for a couple of years now, you can also join his Patreon. But I really want to dig deeper here. So I want to make music with pure Ruby. SonicPy has all kinds of interesting technology below the hood that is not Ruby, written in C and C++ to make it perform in this awesome way. But I don't really care about performance that much here. I want to learn how to make music just with Ruby. So this is probably one of the most simplest examples that you can actually run in Ruby. And I've written a little bit of extra code that allows us to generate something and then output it as a WAV file, which is a sound file. And so I can play it back in the browser. And this is what it sounds like. It's not much, but it is something, right? So how does this work? I mean, how does it really work? So this is kind of a schematic of how this actually works. If you think about it, the computer is actually generating electrical signals that is then sending to a loudspeaker. And the loudspeaker is essentially an electromagnet that is connected to a large diaphragm, and that gets pushed out by the electromagnet, by the signals that's coming from the computer. And it pushes out air molecules, and these essentially make airwaves that then reach your ear. And your ear has this extremely complicated apparatus that turns the airwaves back into electrical signals of sorts, like nerve impulses. And these nerve impulses then reach the brain. And the brain turns all of that into music. I want to focus on the first part, like how do we end up from code to electrical signals that go out of the computer. And for that we need a digital to analog converter, or DAC, and usually that's within a chip, and this is one of those chips. And if you convert a digital signal to an analog signal, you're essentially turning like discrete values into a continuous signal. And this comes with a completely unique set of problems. And unfortunately, I can't really go into the details here. But if you want to know more about this, on my website at rubysynth.fun, you will find a lot more information about this. And it's really important to understand what's going on there, because otherwise you're making all kinds of weird mistakes that turn into really weird sounding things. And I'm going to ignore most of that actually for the rest of the presentation. So let's build a Ruby synth. You've seen this code before. It creates a square wave at 440 Hertz, and it sounds like this. You've heard it before. So why 440 Hertz? Well, 440 Hertz is the concert pitch. It's the A above middle C, and it is kind of the pitch that everyone who plays concert music, for example, but also synthesizers and everything, everyone agreed upon this frequency, because if you want to play together, you need to agree on a certain frequency, otherwise all of your instruments will be out of tune, right? So everything I'm going to tell you now is based on Western notation, and I think it's kind of important to point that out. Other cultures and countries and regions in the world use completely different systems. And I can only, because I only know Western notation, I can only speak about that perspective. And I think that's kind of important to point out. So you've probably seen this before. This is a schematic look at a piano keyboard. And it has all these white keys and black keys. And the concert pitch A you can find there in the middle. And if you go down an octave, basically you're going to the next A, you're ending up at half the frequency. And this is one of the first principles of how you divide up the sound frequencies into different notes. And an octave is made up of 12 halftones. There are like 7 white notes and 5 black notes. And the white notes are called C, D, E, F, G, H, B for some reason. And the black notes can be either called sharp, that is when you go up half a step, or they could be called flat if you go down half a step. But as you can see, C sharp and D flat are actually the same note. They are just called differently in different contexts. If you want to know how to get a frequency for a certain note, you can use this formula. You just plug in a number, and the number is a so-called MIDI note. 0 would be a very low C, and then 60 would be the middle C, and 69 is the concert pitch A, and that's how you end up with this formula. Now it's important to note that this formula gives you a so-called equal temperament or equal tuning. And this is not always the perfect way to divide up the notes. There are some weird irregularities if you're trying to put together like a perfect list of pitches, and people disagree a lot about how you should do that. For our case, that's totally fine though. So here's a square wave at 440 Hertz. You've heard that before, right? Now, I've used a slightly different visualization here. That is not the waveform itself, but the actual frequency spectrum. And I know it sounds horrible, so we need to talk about what we can do about that. And I'm going to start sculpting a sound here. I'm using a technique or technology that is called Subtractive Synthesis. It sounds a bit weird, but what it means is that you start with high harmonic content and then you filter it down. A bit like the famous saying how Michelangelo created his famous sculptures. You know, he started with a large block of marble and then cut away everything that doesn't look like David. And we're using a filter for that. So what's a filter? Here's a filter. This is a so-called state variable filter. And if you look at this diagram long enough, you will probably find a way how to express this in code. And we're going to do that in a second. But the interesting thing here is that you can also look at this if you're an electrical engineer, and you could turn that into a circuit. And that's what people have done. You know, the state variable filter works as well in electronics as it works in software. So here's the code for that, some of the code. And the state variable filter is pretty cool because it outputs different types of filter results. And I'm going to show you the results now. So to display this a little bit better, I'm not going to use the square wave, I'm going to use noise. And as you can see, it's just rand and then putting it into the right value range. And if you do that, you end up with something that sounds like white noise. And the characteristics of white noise is that it contains all the frequencies in the same way, in the same volume. And so if we apply a low pass to that, which should only let through the low frequencies, and we do that at 2000 Hertz, it sounds like this. And you can kind of see the frequency response of that filter there in that graph. I can do the same thing with a high pass, which does exactly what you think it does. And that sounds interesting because it allows you to model a couple of things that are, so we're going to come back to that noise thing pretty quickly. So something is still wrong though, and I'm going to play another sound, a different sound to you, which is a recording of a piano. And you probably noticed that there's something in there that our sounds so far didn't have, and that is variance over time. It kind of starts with these harsh tones at the beginning and then fades out a little bit, and it has this, it also gets a little bit more mellow in the end. So there's variance over time, and that's very important. And we can do that with our square wave or with our noise as well, and for that we use envelopes. Not these kind of envelopes, but these kind of envelopes. So this is an attack, decay, sustain, release envelope, and this is kind of the most common envelope, and it allows you to shape a volume over time. And this is the code for it. It's intentionally small and unreadable because it's terrible code and you should not look at it, but it does the job. So let's shape everything with it. First of all, we're going to shape the volume. And so the sound is going to go, start a little bit quieter, then gets louder, and then gets quieter again, and so on and so forth. And that sounds like this. And that already sounds a lot nicer. What if we also change the filter frequency with the envelope? That sounds interesting because it has some of the same characteristics as that piano, right? It starts a little bit harsher in the beginning and then gets more mellow. Exactly what we want. We can also modulate the pitch, so the frequency of the tone that we're generating. And it sounds a bit weird at first, right? What is that going to be good for? Which brings us to an interesting different topic. We now have all of the things together to build synthesizer sounds, but we want to make some dance beats, right? So we need some drums. And we are going to generate these drums with our synthesizer techniques as well. And I'm going to show you one example, which is the snare drum. And a snare drum sounds like this. This is a sample from a real snare drum. And it has all of these different components. The first component is if you hit the snare drum with the stick, which is what's happening in the sample here, the drum head, the actual head of the drum, is going to hit, and it's going to emit a very sharp impact sound, almost like a click. And it doesn't sound long; it's just really short in the beginning. And then you have something which is called the body, which is the rest of the snare drum, and it gets attenuated by the stick as well, and it kind of vibrates for a little bit longer because it just has more mass, and it's vibrating, and it's hard wood, so it does vibrate very well. And so that's kind of the body of the snare. And the last part is the actual snare, which is just a couple of wires that you see there hanging over, or rather under, the head, and they get also attenuated by the stick, and then they vibrate against the actual head of the drum, and it creates this rather noisy tone. So you have these three components, and we can actually model the first two ones together by taking a tone, and the tone will have roughly the frequency, or will have the frequency of the body of the snare drum, and then we will pitch it up really, really quickly at the beginning, and that will give us a sound that kind of resembles the impact of the stick at the drum, and it sounds like this. And you can hear it, that it almost sounds like a drum. It's not perfect, but we're getting there. Now for the snare, that's quite simple. That's just a little bit of noise that we had before, and I'm using an envelope to shape the amplitude. And that sounds like, stupid stuff, but it's actually good enough. If we mix all of this together, it sounds almost like the snare drum at the beginning. So with a lot of these techniques, for example, if you lower the frequency of the body, you end up with a bass drum, which is just a bigger drum, and is like the kick drum, the underpinning of a modern dance beat. And if you only play around with noise, you can generate sounds that sounds like cymbals, and you can combine all of these together, and at the end you end up with this. This, I mean. And so that's our drum beat. But how did I turn the single sounds in this drum beat into the actual beat, like the sequence? And how do we turn sounds into music? And we do that by sequencing sounds. So for that, we need to learn a little bit more of vocabulary. And so we're going to talk about beats, bars, and other things. So everything I'm going to explain is meant in a measure of 4/4. And what that means is that you just have a beat that goes like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And it's 4 beats in a bar, so each beat is a quarter note. And music people count from 1, which is irritating to a programmer. A bar. A bar can be divided up in different ways. So if you only have one note that plays for the whole bar, that's a full note. But you can also have half notes, quarter notes, eighth notes, 16th notes. And so that divides up the bar into different parts. And if you take the 16th notes as kind of your slots, you can actually create what it's called a step sequencer. And what you see here is probably one of the first step sequencers on the Roland TR-808, a very famous drum machine. And if you look at these 16 buttons down there that have different colors there, this very, very cool color scheme, you well, actually it's quite warm, but anyway. You will see that there are 16 buttons and you can just press them, and when you press them, you switch on the drum at that very specific slot. And that's how you can quickly build your drums. We also need to quickly talk about tempo to get the maths right. So tempo is given in BPM, which is beats per minute, or in our case, quarter notes per minute. And we can do some sequence of maths now. So BPM is 120. If we want to get the beat length in seconds, we just divide 60 by the BPM and we end up at half a second. The bar length is 4 times of that, obviously, and 16th note length is essentially the beat length divided by 4, so an eighth of a second. We can organize our musical things in different ways. So we start off with the notes. The notes are collected in patterns, in case you're wondering where the talk title comes from. And you can take these patterns and arrange them into songs. So a pattern is just a collection of a couple of notes together. It could be 1 bar long, it could be 2 bars long, whatever you need. And a song allows you then to arrange these patterns into a complete structure. So let's build a DSL for that, because we want to do it in software, right? Here's a drum pattern, real quick. So the asterisk is an on is a 1, and the dash is a 0. For notes is a little bit more complicated because I need to state the length of the note as well. The P is just nil. It's just to show that there's a pause, and so you can generate a pattern from that as well. And you can also give more than one note to play chords. And then we can arrange all of this into a song. So here's a song. It's a very short song, and also it doesn't sound very good because there's a lot of things missing. And unfortunately, I can't really go into the details here, but what you need to do to turn this into a better song is do mixing. And so usually in like traditional music studios, this is done in a mixer or mixing desk, and it's this huge thing that you've probably seen on photos or in a studio. And it has all these channels, and all these channels, each channel is for one instrument, and you can adjust all kinds of parameters for these channels. You can change the frequency bands and everything, and then they all go together in the sum. And you can also send some part of the signal to so-called send channels, and these send channels allow you to put modifications on the audio that you kind of want to group together, and these modifications would be called effects. Just one example of such an effect would be a delay or an echo, and a delay is really just that, what it means. It's just delaying the signal. And so in code, that would be a ring buffer. And if we want to turn a delay into an echo, we just add feedback, which means that you put some of the signals that come out of the ring buffer back into the beginning. You need to make sure that you don't put in the same amount, because then you will get feedback, but feedback that grows bigger and bigger. But if you do it right, you will get something that sounds like an echo. And this is the code for it. It's really simple, and it sounds like this. And like I said, I have lots of other things that I put together there. You can look at the code, you can look at all the examples. But if we put this all together, it looks a little bit like this. Thank you very much.